Hello. Hello. Nice.
Just testing it, make sure that the audio works, and then we'll get started.
Yep, looks good to me.
Sweet, okay.
Yeah.
Would you mind getting the door?
Yep.
Welcome all. Thank you so much. It's really nice to meet you. What's your name?
Sean.
Sean, very nice to meet you,
Thank you for
Sean.
having me.
What do you do for work?
I drive an accessible taxi for seniors and people with disabilities.
That's really cool. What brought you here today?
I saw your poster at Dalhousie,
Oh, cool.
and I'm also finishing.
Oh, what are you taking?
I'll finish with philosophy in the fall.
Really cool.
I have a semicolon tattoo.
Oh,
Cool.
sweet. Oh, thank you for, Sean, did you say?
Sean.
Sean, we got two Seans here today. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us today. It's really glad to be here around the many faces who I've worked with all these people on the side for the years and, through emergency mental health. And that is my lovely partner and fiance Katie as well, who is my secret ghostwriter through the entire thing. But today I will be talking about the theory that basically underlies the entire book, and hopefully in a simple enough way not to confuse people, because we could literally take a course on this for an entire week, but my goal is basically just to get some of the main concepts. I've divided it into a couple of different parts. At first, we're going to look at why we want to talk about stories, where identity fits into it, why existentialism is one of the philosophies that we're incorporating in here, and then lastly, how all that is applied through the NC model. And if you have questions around, please feel free to yell them out as you want. Liz, what was the first story you ever heard?
Oh gosh, like in my whole life,
Yeah.
probably my sister reciting a book called Dragon in the Woods.
Dragon in the Woods. That's really cool. What about you, Colin? That explains a lot. It might just be like Sean. Yeah, Sean.
The first one I remember is my brother who did a lot of drugs. He was talking about a UFO that landed in the field behind my mom's house, and that's the first. And it was very vivid, and that's the first story that I.
That is very creative. Yeah, I'm getting quite the experience at that. Yes, yeah. And I mean, a couple of things is number one, since the moment that we are ever born, we are told stories. They may not necessarily be dressed like that. Since the moment our parents and our caregivers can speak, they are telling us and describing what is happening around us. In cultures, we use stories primarily to teach morals. Most of the child books I remember growing up, whether it was Roger Rabbit or The Boy Who Cried Wolf, very much had some implications in terms of these are things that are accepted around society, and these are things. Another way in which we tell stories is when we talk about life, when we talk about religion, and when we talk about how we relate to one another and how we treat each other. So in this sense, since the very beginning that we are brought into earth, we are told that life works in certain ways, and this starts to shape our morals, our values, our meanings, and our expectations for how we can expect for life to play out if we do certain things. And to quickly put it out there, this entire work is based on the concept of narrative identity, which got popularized by a psychologist, McAdams, who basically theorized that life could be understood as a continuous and evolving internalized life story that continues to change and adapt as we gain new experiences. And we'll talk about that adaptation and that dynamicness that ultimately helps us see suicidality, hopefully in a little bit different of a way. We've got the one and only, the suicidologist, researcher, physician, clinician, Dr. Igor Galanker, who originally came up with the suicide crisis syndrome. So my work comes from his subacute phase, which looks at a suicidal narrative. So he proposed that if you develop suicidal thoughts, those thoughts start going in specific themes. And through over the very beginning history of suicidology, he basically integrated different concepts, different themes, and theories to postulate how those processes interact to lead to an acute suicidal state. So the easiest way to explain it is that if somebody develops suicidal thinking, there will be two components that he focuses on. Number one, there is the goal orientation, which in our story realm basically is divided into I have expectations of something, I believe that those expectations have happiness and that I'm owed that happiness, and lastly, that I will try and continue to do those same things so I can get those goals. If we're not able, Gallagher proposes that as, for example, any significant goal that has um, uh, a lot of value in it. He focuses on the trait of perfectionism, saying that if you try really hard in a very narrow field that is likely to fail, you're likely going to be disappointed. What I look at in this theory is the general population in terms of what about our daily disappointments and our daily failed expectations? And will impact how we look at that from the individual lens. But from the second half of Gallagher's work is also maybe the more interesting part, the interpersonal dynamics. So if I'm trying to get a need met that I was told would happen, and particularly to me, if I do these things and I keep doing those things and it doesn't happen, eventually somebody enters a state of, like a dog, learned helplessness, or as he calls it, defeat. In defeat, you start feeling these shames of humiliation and guilt. And through that humiliation and guilt, you start to create a sense of burdensomeness that you tell yourself. Those thoughts of burdensomeness then create a loss of connection because you are moving away from people. And then lastly, he would say that if all you are likely to escalate to an acute suicidal state, which he termed the suicide crisis syndrome, which describes a concept of entrapment. We went too far. Sorry, Bob. This is really a really weird thing that I'm going to acquainted to you is using my last naming things because I'm not allowed to use like my stuff like that. Gaze CSS for more. That's me. Just saying. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but because I want to focus on the clinical applications. How is it that if somebody presents modality, we can look at narrative identity and say, well, how can I help that individual? The three areas that I focus on with regards to an individual's narrative identity are within this framework that we call the CSS, that basically describes all the components that you need for a movie. Like you have the character, which helps fulfill your philosophical question of quote unquote, who am I? What is that character made out of? In order for the character to have much sense, you need to look at their setting. That ultimately gives you reinforcement and a sense of value. So, for example, I and Matthias get a sense of reinforcement in knowing that, whoa, that was weird. Is that a microphone? Yeah. Okay. No? You don't hear that echo? Oh, maybe it's just one up here. It's a bad story. That was really funny. Yes, getting back into it. Yes, the whole goal is, so a person is having suicidality. Well, let me take a look at how are you seeing your life and how are you understanding experiences to begin with. That understands with how do you see yourself, and then how is that sense of self reinforced about how you see yourself in society. lastly, if that is reinforced by the people around you or even by the thought that you are providing in that sense, then that ultimately is going to give you that sense of direction or the script, for example. And to quickly give this a beautiful little backstory, it came from a very manic summer with a lot of papers and notes, but we had met this indigenous Navajo medicine man at the Las Vegas um, conference. His name's Aaron. Aaron. I haven't been able to find him. Oh, it's his kids. But when I met Aaron, he came and talked to us, and he knew that we were presenting at the conference, and he was really interested. And he just came up and he was like, "So, what are you presenting on?" And at that time, it was Gallenker's narrative crisis model, and he just sat there and started talking to me about how his beliefs and the things that he had seen through his own community. And he explained that suicide and, as he recalled, substance use and mental illness did not exist in those communities before. And he explained that the people were removed from the places that they called their homes. They were separated from their families, and they had their language taken away. And the part that stood out to me so much is that he said, Matthias, they have forgotten who they are. You know, they cannot remember like where they came from, and because of that, they're swimming life just looking for that sense of understanding. So that beautiful man, when I was sitting in bed, ultimately, I knew I wanted to focus on the self in some regard, but that is what kind of helped to tie it all in. Uh, and so, clinically speaking, and it sounds very simple, but we all very much struggle when a patient comes in and they mention suicidality. We don't go straight up and ask, "Why are you suicidal?" That is typically they're not going to be able to give you an answer. So we start asking around, like, "Well, what's going on in your life?" And one of the problems that we tend to focus on is what is happening in your life too much, as if something has triggered suicide. And for somebody who is in the middle of it, they do not see or believe that maybe that one thing that really triggered some of those thoughts is that factor. They actually see that, you know, if we think back to Gallagher's stage, if somebody's feeling burnsomness, if somebody's feeling ashamed, they're feeling lonely. They're not feeling at a good place where they can necessarily communicate their best senses of self. So they're going to relay that emptiness that they feel inside through it. So if I ask an individual, what is going on in your life? It's a double-edged sword because the individual hasn't found that positioning in there. So it's kind of like asking him to look at a menu and order something from me without putting any other words on the board for him. So what individuals are ultimately striving for is to be understood and to see themselves in a story that could make sense for them. So one of the first things to focus on most superficially is the role. And this is what gives us what we call meanings of life. So we have little meanings in life. For example, this coffee, which if I don't have in the morning, will make me very, very irritable and probably really tired. But tell you what, over time, if I don't have my coffee, I will get over it. But it is part of my routine. So not having it does affect my motivation and my direction and how I do things. So it could be that somebody, for example, on their way to a test, spilled their entire extra large coffee, you know, on themselves. And we're sitting there and you're like, okay. And the thing was that like their mother was really cruel before that happened. You know, they spent their last $10 on that coffee. And it's not so much all those events, but so much how they feel their life is now being written for them, the deterministic feel of that. So for us, it's not so much like figuring out what their story is, but making sense of it. So by asking, for example, like who a person is, if you sit down, if I sit down with Ben's kid and I'm like, who are you? That's a really deep question. Most of us don't even ask ourselves that question, right? But how I like to gravitate or think about those questions is, where do you feel like yourself? You know, where do you feel like that sense? And you'll find different answers for that depending on what type of life. If you're a teenager, that's probably gonna be your friends. You know, if you're a younger child, probably gonna be your parents. If you're an adult, it might be your partner, and so on and so on. But ultimately, these so if I start asking an individual around those things, I can start to cue in around, well, what is it? How do they see that individual, right? From a male figure, for example, we are very much bad at feeling like we make mistakes, making ourselves vulnerable, asking for help is one of the most challenging things that we can do. And we see ourselves as very much somebody that has to solve problems in that. So males, our general character tends to be the problem solver. So if I'm not solving that problem, whether it is at work or whether it's within my family, there is going to be that sense that is going to be internally telling me that, like, you know what, like you're not serving that purpose. You're not going to be thinking of it that way. What your brain is going to start telling you is you're this, or you're not doing this enough. And ultimately, through your experiences through others or your setting, that can be shifted. So if, for example, I'm running really fast after my parents told me not to, and I fall and I scrape my knee, and and I go back to my parents, and in the first scenario, the parents like, see, what did I tell you would happen? And I'm in a lot of pain, and I needed that support. In that scenario, you get taught that, well, you know what? If I do not meet these things and if I make mistakes, then I am not valuable and I'm not contributing to those things. So that same kid, for example, if he fails a test or doesn't do a chore, will identify with this internal theme of guilt. If, on the other hand, for example, we are able to provide an aspect of true honesty with support in that, and you can reinforce number one, a person that is in pain cannot think critically very much at that moment in time, kind of like somebody's that's suicidal. So support can come in a lot less direct ways than that. And say a lot of the people we see are already kind of distance from some sort of setting. I would say, particularly if you see a lot of youths, most folks don't know who they're going or who they are and where they're going, but they are very much identified through their peers, how they feel within their peers. So depending around how things change with their family or with their friend group, that is going to affect how they feel they're moving together with life that is apparently working for everyone else. And lastly, the last part of it is the script, or where somebody feels like they're going. And the point of focus at the last part is to get a sense of time and location. And it seems very bizarre, but when somebody is in that acute suicidal state, they are not very much oriented into what's actually happening because they're very much deer in the headlights. So it's not like they do not know that they are in a hospital room or that they forgot their name or something like that, but they are in a sense of disconnection from those things, in those things having meaning from them. So let's talk about identity. This is where I can start drawing, which is really fun for me. So we're going to start with Freud. Freud basically was the dude that popularized the idea of the ego and that we have different parts, and that those different parts interact. We cannot see them. He made a little iceberg phenomenon, if you remember. So you got your superego up here, you got your ego, and then your ID, which is buried underwater. So to Freud, it's basically like we need to unearth this memories from underwater, and there's going to be basically a goalkeeper between your ego and your superego, and you figuring that out will help you get better and identify. Which seems like a bunch of jargon, brilliant in the sense of our psyche not being a material thing. But where he loses all sorts of credibility is that all of his theories are psychosexually based and also neglect the aspect that his patients were likely children that were experiencing abuse that was not accepted or seen at that moment in time. So aside from that criticism, it's a line. So if you think about this line, the idea, the ego and the superego, think of this in the same way as we ask, are you having suicidal thoughts? Do you have a plan? And are you going to act on them? And this is what we work with. We think that, underneath it, it should actually be inverse, like the higher, more risky thoughts are buried underneath. But we basically sit down with the patient and we have the belief that, you know what, if I unearth some of those memories, then I will understand why you're becoming suicidal. I will figure these things out, and then we'll put a little safety plan and we'll make you very happy and everything will be great. But there is another incredible psychoanalyst who is also very, what's the proper word? Eccentric. He was eccentric, he was controversial, and he was also very confusing. He was very pompous at the time. Lacan, as they like to call him. And outside, his work got buried a lot because it got number one, it was a specific school of thought, but at the same time, it was not as popular as Freud, who had this sexy, like mother type of phenomenon. But the interesting thing about Lacan is that he challenged Freud's concept of the ego. And he challenged the aspect of it basically being linearity within itself. So he would say, for example, that as opposed to unearthing the memories, these bad memories, what you're actually doing is you are changing the shape of those memories with time. And through every experience that you go, those memories will actually come up differently. So he would say that it is not a line. And he worked on the topography of quote unquote the psyche and working on mathematical models to represent his ideas of the self. And brilliantly, he started thinking of what was it? Originally, it was the Borean knot. And it'll all make sense eventually. But he thought that basically this is our psyche, and they're interconnected. And our psyche, which all is held in the same cup, is divided into three different domains, which how we process experience. Number one, there is the imaginary. Number two, there is the symbolic. And lastly, there is what is real. And the interesting thing about this model is that all these sections interconnect all at once. So in order for life to make sense, we actually connect all those things as we are growing up as children. He further advanced this theory by creating the Mobius strip, which is basically, if we were to look at this from the side, it looks a little bit like an infinity symbol, kind of shoelace. And those are the three elements interacting within each other. His last model, and perhaps the most fascinating one, is ultimately how we conceptualize narrative identity within the NC model. And it begins with the donut. And so this is basically like seeing these circles from the top of it. So Shay, at the top of it, you have what would be the real, then the symbolic, and then at last the imaginary. And they're constantly interacting with each other. So the beautiful thing that got brought out through the NC was thinking about the suicidal mind the same way. And thinking about, well, our identity isn't just a one playing field where a story gets told. It has similar dimensions like it. But how do we organize those dimensions of the self, and how does that self get reinforced? Well, first, we got to talk about his stages of the mirror theory. So Lacan believed that the moment that you start identifying with your sense of self, there is already an incongruence because we are not these individuals how we see ourselves. We grow up as sentient beings that have these emotions. And we also imagine how we come up with our thoughts is different than how we visually perceive them. So he would say that since the first moment that a child looks at himself in the mirror, he is challenged with the thought that I am not life is not representing me in my most ideal self. And a youth learns to, or sorry, the baby learns to adapt through that, basically through means of communication and learning language, which is still imperfect because communicating emotions and feelings through language is never accurate. So he hypothesized that our constant struggle is actually going through life trying to represent that most honest version of ourselves that can never really happen. And same with our intentions and our thoughts that get organized into our basic communications. And he would argue that when we're having these crises or when we're having difficult times, it's because we are struggling with that internal sense of where who am I without all these different pieces in place right now? And um, uh, so from one aspect, kind of like narrative identity in the story, every single individual will start to feel like sometimes your life doesn't feel like yourself, or you don't feel like your optimal self in that regard. And in part, the acknowledging the interdependence of these things, or what makes a self, is what he theorized could help piece that individual back together. He would say that it's not so much about digging the unearthed memories as much as interpreting them in the right way for the patient. So, how do we interpret meaning then? There is a very interesting American psychologist, Robin Meister. He wrote on some theories about suicide, and particularly the acuter version of the self. That basically, similarly, when you escalate through suicidality, eventually you get stuck into a really icky version of yourself that feels so ugly that you basically want to escape from that human suit, as he would say. More importantly, he actually did some work on thanatoology, or quote unquote, grieving and loss. And through talking and interviews of individuals that had suffered traumatic or abrupt instances or had lost significant ones, he came up with pillars, as he called them, that would basically be that were found to be essentials to create meaning and let through all these different conditions. So with those, we have aligned those core meaning values with the narrative identity for somebody. So this will make a lot more sense in one of these very confusing pictures, which maybe I should actually show you. Because it's a lot. And like I said, we could do an entire week of this, but basically the way you should think about it is that every line is a different concept that works within this big circle of the self. And they work conjointly within the concept of suicidality to make suicide within a life personal narrative the more optimal solution at a moment in time, per se. So if you look at the top of it, we have so these are existential layers, what we call them, which is basically our most superficial part or self. And these are all needs that reinforce that sense of the story and that coherence of life being what it is. Hold on, what's that guy? The fractured self-continuum. I usually mix these guys and these guys, but they have two very different purposes. So from one aspect, all of these things are not physical, but they are basically cognitive domains that reinforce your sense of I have purpose in life because I'm contributing. I feel like a valuable member because others feel like my work is reciprocated. And I feel like my life is coherent because things are adding up like the expectations are meaning to. Through in between these layers of identity, so say by purpose, which is maybe if I say work or being a provider in that sense, that is being reinforced by the existential anchor of that is purpose in itself. So if that becomes threatened, then what starts happening is, well, in my life narrative, I'm going to start getting a little disoriented in terms of who I am in that script. And then from a goal-oriented basis, the first thing that is going to start coming undone is my senses of meaning. So how do I create meaning? The very first way, which I'm going to do that, is if I'm a provider and say the work has let everyone go, but I am stuck with the aspect of I am not driving an Uber because that is not the type of life that my family deserves. I'm not taking any other jobs. That is just making my situation much worse. And at the highest point, it works very superficially just to keep you in that automatic loop. But ultimately speaking, if that starts to rupture my social identity or the relational self, for example, say my wife is now telling me, we got to pay the bills. And maybe they make comments that make you feel like less of a provider in that sense. Well, now your value, you're not going to feel, which is your existential anchor at that point, is going to be taken away. So you no longer see yourself in the role. You no longer see yourself as reinforced. And now you start to see yourself as a burden. And like any individual that starts disconnecting from other individuals, the first thing that you will do is, if I go from this isn't happening and I cannot blame myself, I'm going to start projecting to other individuals. So I may become nasty. I may see things that I don't mean to. And the hidden purpose of that is reinforcing that belief that I'm a burden and I am acting as a burden to individual. And the biggest thing, I'll say this time after time, people sometimes are not the kindest of humans when they are in that acute suicidality. People describe them as different people, and it is because they are responding on automatic channels. So if ultimately speaking, others cannot reinforce that sense of reciprocity. Say, for example, I come home and then my kids and my wife hug me and they're like, I don't care what you do for work, and I end up taking that Uber job. Guess what? Even though I don't see myself in the highest sense of purpose, I still have that purpose because it's being reinforced that my role is being valued by everyone else. But if that is not, then my self-worth starts being damaged. And now I start thinking of myself as being worth less than other individuals. At this point, if you don't have your sense of self, and this would go back to Baumeister, you don't have that confidence, what ultimately is going to start taking over is all the icky thoughts that you're constantly trying to battle for yourself. So all those feelings of guilt and shame are going to come up to the surface and you're going to start splitting. So why do we start splitting in those situations? Well, as your body starts taking more capacity and feels less engaged with the script that they had felt anticipated, eventually we're going to go more into our primitive defense mechanisms. And splitting is a very valuable one because it can work in both directions. If I'm feeling really worthless, that means that everybody else is really good. And that means that that's why they have to stay away. If I'm feeling really good, but I'm feeling like others are really bad, then even more the reason to stay away from them. So ultimately, that lack of sense of self starts creating that acute phase of suicidality, or what we term the lack of location and orientation within your life story. So this is when things start getting a little sketchy. So we took away the character, we took away the setting, and we took away the script. What do you have left? You have an individual that feels like they're in a human suit with emotions that they cannot understand, with a narrator that they don't identify with. And probably one of, or if not, one of the most dangerous aspect is our emotional or embodied self. And it is that aspect of, I feel okay and I feel safe. And sadly, if I don't have anything to resort to that can validate that, I'm resorting to my most primitive selves. And what do we try to do when we're feeling really terrible about these emotions? Bury them really deep. because at this point, it's the only thing that's in her mind. But the scary thing is, if you take away the emotions, you start to take away some of the significance and implications. So, in the most, or what we call the primal identity or the protoself, basically somebody's working on their autonomic nervous system. At this point, if you have repressed your emotions for a period of time, you are not able to identify your triggers or even acknowledge the aspect that something is going wrong. Your autonomic nervous system is going to go into hyperdrive. And now you're just acting as if there is a bear in the room. And you're either going to want to fight or you're going to want to fly away. And because you have removed the script, you've removed the setting, and you remove the character around it, the only thing to fight left is yourself. And in a point and period in time where somebody feels like they have lost full control and life does not make sense, ultimately that solution becomes that escape or the fight through flight, which at times can look very different, whether they're males or females and how they're communicating those things. And most importantly, and what we all see that gives us those creepy little feelings is individuals that aren't just saying the things that we want to hear, but are responding to things as if they were in a completely different place. And those individuals that, maybe like anxiously laughing, even though everything is bad, or, they have this eerie calmness from it. And that's because that would be their reaction formation aspect. And not so much subliminally, but internally, the one part that their brain can grasp is that there's a solution to this. So, in some senses, that projection of the all good and all bad gets turned towards suicidality, or the world and what you know it is the all bad, and suicide becomes the aspect of control for it. So, this is a lot of cool stuff. So, what do we do with the patients now? Well, I tell you what, if I'm seeing this kid, so if we've talked about all these things, and it's a lot of stuff, it's very confusing and it's all happening at once. But if you focus on the very essentials of like what makes us human and what do we care about, interactions with other beings, feeling like we're in this world and feeling good about ourselves. Now, if I start the question by focusing on the event, it takes away from the individual and it takes us further away from the sense of having some autonomy within their narrative. So timing is absolutely everything. And some patients might give us more than others. We all know those patients that you might be 45 minutes into the assessment. Not giving you nothing. Oh, sorry. Yes, they're not giving you anything. They're just telling you, I don't know. And our biggest impulse for those situations is to want to know and to want to find more. But we do it in a way that becomes intrusive, paternalistic, and takes away a lot more control because ultimately safety is our biggest concern. But the thing is that you cannot assess something that is not communicated to you. And somebody is not going to trust in communicating those things that they cannot trust that you will hold for them in that space. So sometimes the communications or interactions don't have anything to do about the suicidal thoughts themselves, but in helping the individual see a version of themselves that they can live with. It doesn't need to be this quote unquote like, hey, look, all your troubles are away. It's actually quite the opposite. It's it's understanding that as horrible and as ugly of life as it is incredible that the person is still alive to talk to us in there, and that could change any second and moment in time. And that fragility is ultimately how we should be our should be trying to. I'd say our systems are really difficult, particularly having worked in emergency departments of stepping in and being like, like I've thought a lot about the how do you just walk up to somebody and say, who are you? It's not going to work. But if you start disengaging it, if you start making metaphors, for example, movies in the senses or scripts or stories that everybody understands, we don't have to talk about suicide, but we can talk about the things in your life that have mattered so much that you're not seeing in there anymore. Um, And we're going to close off into a last little example, probably very soon. But one of the main things when we are approaching these conversations with the youth, I think I mentioned it at the beginning, and I am the walking example of that, where I'm like, I breathe toxic positivity and I want to fix everything. So, in my best way, I'm sure, like, I want to be fishing for information that'll be like, I get it. This is your story and the whole 9 yards. But we're going to be looking for stories that have that brighter side in there, which is inauthentic. And ultimately, finding more about that pain is what helps us co-construct that. Because if an individual is is able to open up with vulnerability, you know that they have trusted you enough to hold a little bit of that pain. So as opposed to being Matthias the savior that's like, I'll hold on to your pain, here is your appointment, here is your admission, or let me say all this very positive stuff. It is actually like holding for a moment and understanding what this person, this individual is going through in the moment in life as that human in time. And if they give us that little in, then we're able to start co-constructing. It may not be an entire story, it may just start with a sentence in terms of like, fuck man, like I really wish this would have happened this way. And that can be one of the most honest things we can talk about. But it is unfair to expect that during the worst period in their life, they're going to be talking about the things that are most uncomfortable with a total stranger that, has a double intention to also find those plants and take them away right away. But what we will find is that ultimately speaking, if somebody has been thinking about suicide, if somebody has been thinking about a plan, for example, they can find different ways, they can adapt. But the thing that will be different will be, will they want to communicate that to somebody? Because if somebody can no longer see themselves and they can no longer see themselves in comparison to others or in this world, a person that is able to see them as somebody for who they are at that moment in time doesn't need to rewrite their story, but it brings the chapters back together. They come to us with like their life story, basically like with paper scrambled on together into Matthias' massive essay in draft format, and they're basically like, here, fix this. And our job is not so much to be like, where does this all fit? That will actually come quite naturally, but shifting the conversations towards more, what is more meaningful to the individuals? Who are the people in the life that this person cares about what they think? And most importantly, how are they not seeing themselves? Because suicidality very much often starts with an internal conflict that gets reinforced by ourselves as our minds get quieter, emptier, and lonelier through that. So, what would this look like on a person that came in? Well, first and foremost, well, how much information and data is this person giving us from their story? How much can they pull from? Because an individual that is not giving me or cannot pull a lot of context, I would say, uh, they could be in a lot of different ways along the defense mechanisms. They can be in that denial aspect where they're really angry and the assessment is really crappy, or they can be in that really scary aspect where they're talking very well and we are feeling extremely, extremely comfortable. But the main thing is that they're not situating themselves and they're not putting themselves out there. So some of the questions that I like to start asking around is the events of the timing and the location of these things. So why do these settings matter? What was it about this point in time and place that made that shift for you? And ultimately speaking, especially if we often talk about future plans, individuals paradoxically with suicidality still endorse a lot of future plans. But a big difference that they find is that there is less congruency in terms of how that happens. So if you ask them about a place, a time, or a setting, they cannot come up with those things. And those are the individuals that I'm a little bit more concerned around. Okay, we may need to float together back to the shore because right now you are happy swimming without a life suit and it's really, brashy outside. But a couple of things that to point out as through their actual phrases, and this is through some psychological autopsies and work on suicide notes, but it is number one, not just short sentences, but as Star Wars would say, absolutes. So all or nothings. Schneidman, the founder of Suicidology, said that the most dangerous words in the world of suicide prevention is the four-letter words only. And when individuals start communicating in that aspect, and we think around what processes could they have, where are they, like where's their character in this story to put out this information? Is somebody that is in a really good place and loving their life going to give me a 2-second or 2-sentence thing, or what is this actually about? And I'll emphasize this over and over again because in the character, I think we are all really thrive towards wanting to find out literal roles like a student or a husband or a son or whatever it may be, a suicidologist, for example. But the main thing is that those things do not mean nothing if you do not have the individuals that reciprocate that, and if that means nothing into the world. So sometimes you can find these individuals, for example, that have very successful lives that are basically have subliminal suicidal intentions. They have very chaotic relationships. They got really wild schedules, and that is because they have a role that they see in society, but not necessarily life. So with youth, we often undermine this, but a home is the safest and most uncomfortable place for a youth, but it is sometimes the last place that can prevent them from going into a forest or to a school, because those are the ultimatums. If we're thinking around who they are identifying most with at that moment in time, it's going to be their peers. So if something happens in peers or in relationships, the main thing is, okay, how are the rest of your peers doing right now? And how are you seeing yourself in that relation? Because if that's bubbling, I can anticipate that you are probably in that limbo land and substances may be involved. And then if I throw an ugly parent situation at that, as reasonable as it can be, I no longer have that safe place where if that teenager or youth regresses and they need that parent, you're no longer going to be there. And if you cannot feel safe at home, you're not going to be feeling very safe anywhere else in the world. And in terms of safety planning, I have thought a lot about in terms of how do we actually integrate this into things that are purposeful, and it can be the small steps. Oh, yes, one of the tips, and maybe really silly. Actually, this is a work practice.
Inspire them to live life to the fullest. Idea. We will be sharing the short section activity on the major theme. So bring your friends or bring yourself. Snacks will be served. This is happening in the DMO room on the second floor for folks ages 14 to 18, starting at 3:30. See you there.
In terms of the acute suicidal states and safety planning, one of the things I always talk about is the tug and pull phenomenon with somebody that does not want to communicate. And I have firsthand experienced this by patients who have tried to convince me after like 4 hours of talking to them that this was a suicide plan, only for them to come back like the next day and being like, I lied to you. Like, this is actually what I was thinking about. And in some regards, particularly youth, they're looking for that sense of control and that sense of agency within itself. So if suicide is not one of those things that we want to obviously let them control, then how can we give them other things that help them feel autonomous at that? And it's not so much sometimes the liberty of and freedoms of leaving your door open or not having to take your cell phone away, but sometimes it's just being radically honest, and it's just saying, what would you like to say to me right now? Like, I imagine this is not something of your own accord that, you wanted to say. And those little things sometimes, like, be shocked by how much individuals get that further away. Um, uh, and with that being said, that's it. So take questions if anybody has any questions. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Please enjoy some of the snacks and the food in here, and we will talk in conversation.
Thank you, Matthias.
Salvi, how you doing? We were talking earlier with Liz